One of the happiest feelings that people can possibly experience in this world, but of course we cannot imagine its state in the next life, is when they see someone who abuses or oppresses or hurts others, commits injustice, when they see them removed from that position, when they see that there's some kind of minor justice that is restored, and of course it does not compare to the reality of justice in the afterlife. And we look to examples of how tyrants fall in the Qur'an and the Sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ, in our own history as Muslims, in our history as human beings. And we find oftentimes those of arrogance and power, no matter how advanced their military is, their might, their civilization, no matter how much they have of momentum, as well as many historians would observe and study and spend decades specializing in the history of a specific dynasty or empire, like the Roman Byzantine Empire, like the Persian Empire of the 6th century. And they would say this empire had so much momentum, and it was so advanced, it seemed like it was ready for world domination. No one could have predicted in the early Meccan years of the Seerah, no one could predict that not only would the Romans, who were just defeated and surrendered to the Persians, that they would rebound, let alone rebound to an extent that the Persians would eventually fall at the hands of the small group of Muslims. When we see the wisdom of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, as far as we can identify and interpret in world events, based on history, based on the Qur'an, based on principles of how this world operates, it should give us hope. And so you look at someone like Fir'aun, who got to the extent of not just enslaving people and torturing and killing and murdering newborn boys, for example, not unlike the Zionists who kill newborn boys and girls, men and women. Fir'aun is a person who also said to his people that they should worship him. And this is important to keep in mind. When you think of the pinnacle of power, فَقَالَ أَنَا رَبُّكُمُ الْأَعْلَى, he said, I am your Lord, the Most High. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala caused, after all the signs and time and necessary opportunities for someone like this to turn, and for the people around him to turn back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, due to his arrogance, he was humiliated, destroyed, drowned, his body preserved for those who were there especially, to see what could happen to someone who the day before had all the military power you could imagine. Things change overnight. We don't know how they operate. We don't know what's around the corner. But in the meantime, we strive. And of course, we see another example in the famous figure of Qarun, mentioned in the Qur'an. Qarun is a person who also was given power by Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, testing him in many different ways. And what did he do? With all his power and all his wealth, to the extent that it would take a lot of strong men to carry some of the keys that he had for his palaces. You look at someone like this, and he said, I earned this from my own intellect. I did this, I achieved this. And this kind of pride and arrogance in worldly things, in materialism, in your political power, in anything that you have, could be the greatest cause of destruction for that individual. And of course, no one could imagine that within the span of a day or two or a week, that Qarun would be swallowed up by the earth. You don't know what's around the corner. And so when you look at these examples, and we have, of course, in contemporary history, we have so many examples we talk about often, one of which with the liberation of Algerians from French colonialism. It took millions of innocent lives that were martyred and killed. It took a lot of resistance to what was happening. And of course, to some extent, you find that there was success. There's still more in this world that we seek as Muslims in terms of universal justice. You look at the British Empire and how far it extended out around the world, and how many people were colonized, how many people were oppressed under its rule, Muslims and non-Muslims. And we find many of these lands were liberated from it in some form. The Soviet Union as well, with the Central Asian Muslim countries that were oppressed and continue in some ways to be oppressed. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to alleviate their affairs. But of course, in our times, in the last 2 weeks, we're thinking about and in a way celebrating and thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for the toppling of the Assad regime for 50 years, for 50 plus years, and in fact a little longer. This regime is responsible for the pain and torture and abuse and assault and rape and many other things. I don't wish to go into detail because we're all familiar, and if not, we should be familiar. For the last 50 years, millions of lives were affected by this, many of whom are here and around the world. And so when something like this happens, when a Muslim observes something political unfolding in their times, naturally, some people want to be hesitant. Some people are skeptical. Why should I be happy? What's really happening? For a moment, just remember this. As far as principles go, you don't know what's around the corner. We don't know, none of us know what's in store for us tomorrow, for a nation state, for the ummah. We do not know what's happening next month, next year, in 10 years. But a Muslim of sound knowledge and wisdom would never find it problematic to celebrate the downfall of a dictator who's satanic. Would never find this to be something that is confusing. How should I feel about the downfall of someone who has caused so much pain and injustice? That is separated from what's next. That is separated from an attempt to try to analyze politically. Because you see, with situations like this, when a tyrant falls, naturally a lot of people want to ask, without really having knowledge, really what's behind all of this? And it's important for us to recognize that we don't necessarily need to have opinions on everything that's happening in the world. We don't necessarily have the knowledge, we don't necessarily have the principles, but we do know one thing for sure. The downfall of a satanic, anti-Muslim, anti-Islamic, anti-justice, anti-peace dictator like this is something for us to be happy for, is something for us to be grateful for. And what's waiting in the afterlife is real justice, because in reality, you cannot restore the pain of those who are here and around the world. You can't restore the many bodies that were found in the prisons. You can't restore the many women who came out of prisons, who went in as teenagers and have multiple children. They don't know who their fathers are. You can't restore justice in this world. You can seek it as best as you can and try to stop injustice as much as you can. And that is an Islamic imperative. But in reality, what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has in store for these types of individuals is more severe than any one of us could imagine. And they deserve that and all more. They deserve that and the wisdom and the justice of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. But I do want to caution my community, and I want to remind myself. The topic of the downfall of an oppressor is not about politicians and dictators alone. There are abusers of many forms. There are people who abuse in their positions, in their authority, in their organizations. There are people who abuse children. There are people who abuse women. There are people who abuse men. There are people who abuse young foreigners, locals. So when you look at all the different examples of abuse and oppression and injustice, we recognize that the ayat of the Qur'an are not limited to rulers like Fir'aun. They're not limited to politicians that we can easily criticize as Muslims from the comfort of our homes, while oppression may be happening nearby or in that home itself. So it's easy for us to look at this and say, look at these arrogant people. They are so out of touch with the masses. And that is true. Generally, the political elite who commit injustices in any civilization, in any land, this is purely from a historical and political science perspective. Generally, when you have structural oppression and there are groups of people or corporations or others who are in power in reality, you will find that they will do everything that they can to hold on to that power, no matter what it takes, and they will try every tactic, and they will try with their propaganda to make it seem acceptable to the masses. But oftentimes, when it's exposed, you see how out of touch they are with reality, how out of touch they are with the average person. And there's an example of this not just with politics. An example of this, and I know this seems random, but this is important, the recent killing of the CEO of a healthcare company. You see how out of touch so many politicians are. You see how out of touch so many people with political power are. How many millions of people have died or been killed indirectly because of a structure of injustice and economic inequality. Now, this is not to justify from the Islamic principles and maxims vigilante justice, but this is to say that if you don't understand why people are reacting the way that they are, why the average commentator is responding with a sense of, hey, I'm not going to criticize, this person killed millions of people, we have to be in touch with reality. When justice is taken away from people and structures of injustice replace that reality, people are going to react. Whether or not is justified is a separate issue. And as Muslims, of course, we react to situations within the paradigm of the Islamic worldview. With this, we remember the saying of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. In the very famous narration, لا يدخل الجنة من كان في قلبه مثقال حبة من خردل من كبر. In one riwayah, the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam said, no one who has the smallest amount, the smallest weight, you can say an atom's weight of arrogance will enter Jannah. And there are other narrations that indicate and clarify what is kibr. We all want to enter Jannah. May Allah grant us that. What is kibr? So I don't have it in my heart. So I'm not led to that place in which I can't enter paradise. Arrogance is to reject the truth and to look down on other people. To reject the truth is a form of arrogance. To look down on others is a form of arrogance. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from both. Rejecting the truth does not just mean from outside of the folds of Islam. It also means within Islam. If you are rejecting something that Allah has commanded, you deny that it is true. You deny that it is an obligation. You deny something is a major sin. This is very problematic. Kibr clouds judgment. It blinds people. You see people acting with arrogance around the world and you say, how can you do this? Like, how arrogant are you to think you're invincible? How arrogant can you be and out of touch with reality? But that's what pride does. And so with this, you recognize that pride can corrupt the heart and the soul from within. And of course, it can lead to external oppression of different forms. Pride can be the reason that a student becomes arrogant with their cheating, with what they're doing on campus, with temptations and major sins, and thinks they're getting away with what they're doing. Pride can be the reason that someone with a position of authority thinks they're getting away with what they're doing of abuse in their industry. But eventually, it all falls down. Eventually, it will collapse. Eventually, there's a punishment for it. And the worst of punishments is that arrogance leads you away from Allah's mercy. The worst of consequences in this world is that it leads you away from Allah's mercy. And in the next life, therefore, prevented from entering paradise. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect us from that. Allahumma ameen. If we had to summarize 3 or 4 lessons from the downfall of oppressors, we can say, number 1, clearly and simply, humility is the path to success. The arrogant people like Fir'aun rose with arrogance and fear and everything that they've done. The prophets rose with humility. And their status is the highest status in this world. And that includes the Prophet ﷺ's many examples, exemplifications of tawadu', humility. Even when they were oppressed for over a decade, and they experienced persecution and martyrdom and abuse of all forms. And the Prophet ﷺ entered Mecca with the conquest, the liberation of Mecca. What happened? He entered with his beard touching the saddle of the horse with humility, thanking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, glorifying His praise. So even in times of success, the believer remembers humility is the path to victory. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala grant us that. Number 2 is that, and by the way, humility does not mean you don't have confidence. Humility does not mean the Muslim is not strong and confident in their beliefs and their strategies, just to be very clear. Number 2, of lessons that we learn from the toppling and the downfall of oppressors is for us not to be deceived by materialism. One of the most dangerous things in the world is when people are on social media, especially, or through movies and TV shows and reality, whatever TV, that when people are following celebrities or somebody immoral, a rapper that's immoral, or a celebrity, or an actor, or an actress, or a politician, and they're following individuals who are living lives in which they're committing different forms of injustice against their soul or against other people. And they start to think that success and status, what is social status? That it's associated with materialism. It's associated with your circles, proximity to power, influence. So they start to have the wrong idea of what it means to be successful. When Qarun boasted about his money, don't think it's a far-fetched, bizarre thing. It's exactly what people do today. But they may not explicitly boast about it. They may be showing it off in different ways. The things that they buy, the cars that they drive, it's okay to have good things, but not with arrogance. It's okay to have things, the blessings of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that are bringing you closer to Him, but not with kibr. And so when we see these messages and these reminders, we take from it the lesson for us, the ibrah, is don't let your worldly materialism, your success, your health, your degree, your job, where you live, your ethnicity, don't let any of these worldly things cause you to ever become egoistic or to look down on other people. Inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. The most honorable. You want the greatest status? The most honorable status for you in the sight of Allah is for those who have the most taqwa, God consciousness. Number 3, we take from this as well the trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala's promise that justice will be restored. Some forms of justice will be restored here, and oppression does not last forever. No matter what it is, it does not last forever. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala promises that oppressors will have their day. If not in this world, then of course on the day of judgment. وَلَا تَحْسَبَنَّ اللَّهَ غَافِلًا عَمَّا يَعْمَلُ الظَّالِمُونَ. Do not assume that Allah is unaware of what oppressors do. And don't think of just politicians. Apply this to your life. Any oppressor, anyone who's hurting others or hurting their soul, don't assume that Allah is unaware of what people do. Rather, He delays the punishment for these oppressors for a day in which their eyes will stare with horror. Number 4 of the lessons we take from this is to reflect on the past and the present, to reflect on what's happened so that we don't fall into the same mistakes. But I do want to answer a very important question that arises after the downfall of the Assad regime. A lot of people ask this question because many people have been killed in the last 50 years due to this regime. May Allah accept them as shuhada. Many people are still hurting today. Many people are still affected by this in many different forms. Do all oppressors get toppled and fall in this world? And of course the answer is no. We know this from history. We know this from today. We know this from the Qur'an. We know this from the principles of Islam. The sunnah of Allah in this world is that it's different than the next life. This is the world of actions and choices, good and bad, with opportunity. But the next life is a life of accountability with no opportunity. So when you think of this reality, yes, sometimes oppressors, they don't get the punishment we wish they would deserve and get in this life. It's not expedited for this world. Are there nations that were punished by Allah in this world for their oppression and injustice and evil? Yes. And there are also examples of the opposite. The famous story of Ashab al-Ukhdud, the story of the ditch in Surah Al-Buruj, the story of the boy and the king who oppressed his people and killed all of them in the fire. We have no reference whatsoever in the Qur'an or any authentic hadith about what happened next. After the martyrdom of all these Muslims, what happened next? Allah praises these believers for holding on to their faith and tells us of the miracle of the baby who spoke to the mother and told her to hang on, to be patient. But we know nothing about the king himself. Did he get punished by Allah in this life? Did something horrible happen to him, a tragic ending? Was he replaced? Eventually he died. And every oppressor and every righteous person must die and face Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and face their consequences. We have many other examples even in recent times. When you look at what happened just in the 19th century, in the 20th century, I found 30 different examples of people who are known to have committed injustices and killed maybe millions of people each, or been responsible for it. And we don't know of any really terrible ending for them in this life, but we know when the soul leaves the body, that's when their punishment begins. And amongst them, you have the example of Leopold II of Belgium, caused millions of innocent lives to be taken in Congo. And even till this day, Congo has its own oppression because of its resources. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala make it easy for them. This is a person that we don't know of anything bad happening to him at the end of his life. He died of natural causes as far as we're aware. And of course, you have Stalin and others who committed atrocities and were responsible for the killing of many people. You have slave owners in this country who tortured many innocent people. You have people who are still committing injustices to this day. Seemingly, it looks like they are getting away with it. And once again, real justice is restored on the day of judgment. And that's sometimes difficult. That's part of the test of this world. But we trust in Allah's promise. We trust in that reality and we hold on to that. There is a consequence for every person, good and bad. We also remember from that delay for the afterlife, we remember that there's a purpose to this life. So act. Take action. Do what you can. And with this action, you remember as well, the believers have to be steadfast because success is not necessarily to have your justice restored in this world. Success is for you to hold on to your faith, whether or not that happens, while seeking it. Whether or not it happens, hold on to your faith in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And of course, with that, the reminder that although divine justice is kept for the afterlife, although it is delayed for a day in which oppressors and abusers will stare in horror, we are reminded as well to strive for justice with all that we have. Be strategic, be wise, collectively unite, work together, stay strong, turn back to Allah and seek His help in all things, because ultimately, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tells us victory is for the believers. In the meantime, strive. فَاصْبِرْ وَاصْبِرُوا اصْبِرُوا وَصَابِرُوا وَرَابِطُوا. In so many forms in the Qur'an. إِنَّ اللَّهَ مَعَ الصَّابِرِينَ. Allah is with those who persevere. وَاصْبِرْ وَمَا صَبْرُكَ إِلَّا بِاللَّهِ. Put your trust in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Because ultimately, what we have is the conclusion, تلك الدار الآخرة نجعلها للذين لا يريدون علوا في الأرض ولا فسادا والعاقبة للمتقين, as was recited by many of the great rulers and leaders of the early generations amongst the Sahaba and Tabi'een. Verily, the life of the hereafter meaning success, Allah has assigned for those who are righteous. They don't desire corruption in this world. They don't desire to spread anything evil in this world or to have a form of exaltedness. And the greatest outcome, the victory, is for the believers. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to see, after moments in which oppressors are removed from power, we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to see steadfastness and justice and the restoration of rights as much as we can. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to allow us to see not just a free Syria, but a free Sham and a free Aqsa and a free Bangladesh and Pakistan where many innocent Muslims are being killed. We ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to liberate all of our lands from oppressors, whether they are politicians or they're defenders or they are donors or corporations. And we ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to grant us wisdom and sincerity and consistency in everyday life to seek justice. Justice in terms of our soul and justice in terms of the rights of others. أقول قولي هذا واستغفر الله لي ولكم فاستغفروه إنه هو الغفور الرحيم.